We're also joined from London by our i24 news correspondent there, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, good morning to you.
Good morning, yeah.
I want to start first, and obviously you're with us for this entire segment. I want to start with you, though, in terms of reactions around Europe to the attacks in France. When it comes to media, when it comes to reactions in the public, is there a finger pointed at, Islam in general in and around Europe?
Certainly there's a great resistance to saying that that's the problem. And just here in the United Kingdom, we actually had an incident recently where a refuse collection lorry ploughed into pedestrians in Glasgow. And there's been a very concerted effort to emphasize that this was not a terror attack. But as yet, the driver has not been named, even though he's believed to be alive. 6 people were killed, including 2 grandparents and their teenage granddaughter. And of course, people can't help but try to draw parallels between that and what's been happening in France. And then, of course, even before that in Jerusalem, with similar sorts of attacks where vehicles ploughed into pedestrians. But I must reiterate that as yet, they've been very specific that they don't think that this was somehow connected. Yet many are noting that it is suspicious that the driver has not been mentioned very much at all in much of the reporting. So there is a fear, but there's also a fear that goes hand in hand with that about pointing the finger at Islam. Whenever there's some kind of attack that does appear to be motivated by Islamist extremism, whether it's as a one-off so-called lone wolf attack or as something more coordinated, we find here in Britain at least that many politicians come out with those famous words now, this has nothing to do with Islam. Even in the case of Lee Rigby, the British soldier who was stabbed and decapitated on the streets of London in broad daylight. The next day we found David Cameron, Boris Johnson, the London mayor, people like that saying that this was not connected to Islam. And yet the killers had given interviews to pedestrians and passers-by whilst still dripping with blood on their hands, saying that they were doing this in the name of Islam.
Jonathan, first of all, updating us in where it stands right now, staying with us. Dr. Lopatin, I want to turn to you. It is no secret that, Muslims have been, moving into Europe in droves. When it comes, first of all, what is the situation now and how are they accepted inside Europe? And why are Europeans so afraid? And again, we want to mention that some of the attacks were not connected to extreme Islam.
I think that's very interesting because when you read actually the German newspapers, and especially the comments by the readers, they keep saying that they are fed up actually with the fact that their leaders, Merkel and other actually German leaders keep saying that it's nothing to do with Islam. But in reality, they feel, that most actually terrorist attacks are carried out by people who are associated with Islam. Right. And that's something actually that seems to bother many, many Germans. I mean, the fact that, there's a kind of leadership is living in a state of denial. They refuse to admit that there is a problem and to hold a discussion about this, any debate about, how actually we better integrate Muslim into the European society. And at the same time, make sure that they will be committed to our democratic values, they will be committed to renounce violence and to respect the democratic rules of the games, respect for the rule of law, respect for minorities, respect for human rights. And I think there's a growing fear in Europe.
Muslims in Europe over the course of the last decade, number-wise, when it comes to society?
Number-wise, I think in Europe today, there are approximately 20 million Muslims. France actually has the biggest population of Muslim population. The estimations is about something between 6 to 8 million Muslims. Wow. Germany has roughly 4 or 4.5 Muslims. Well, in Germany, most of them come from Turkey originally, and it's thanks actually to a recruitment agreement that was signed in 1961 between Germany and Turkey. Originally, they thought they're going to come as a Gastarbeiter, guest workers for a short period of time.
I grew up in places around Germany. It's just the Turkish community there is huge.
Yes.
It's huge, right?
Yeah.
So that's when it comes in terms of numbers. But I want to touch again, and this is with you, Tsvi. I want to touch again on what I think there's an agreement here that there seems to be a fear to address militant Islam as what it is in Europe.
I think we have to liberate ourselves from the phobia of being accused of Islamophobia. The war is not on terror. You can't wage war on a tactic. It's like I'm waging war on the blitzkrieg. I'm waging war on the flanking maneuver. The war is against Islamism, to differentiate from Islam.
But is every terror related to, okay.
We could fight a war against Nazism without being called German-phobes. I mean, I could love Beethoven and still fight the Nazis. Okay. I can still admire the medieval philosophers of Islam and still fight Islamism. Islamism is an ism. It's a totalitarian ideology. The aim is to conquer the world. And we have to call a spade a spade. And we also should not be afraid to inquire whether there is something inherent in Islamic civilization that produced this, just as there was no problem in researching if there was something inherent in German culture that produced Nazism. You have thousands of books about that. Today, everybody's afraid to call a spade a spade. The war is on radical, fanatic Islamism. And
I mean, again, but you would agree with me, Jonathan, actually, this is to you, I'm sure you've heard this in studio, that if one leader in Europe comes out and says something like that, then immediately, I mean, I don't want to say he gets shot, but there is a problem with that type of, with that type of an agenda, which coming out and saying something like that.
Because the Europeans have lost, in my opinion, sort of a civilizational self-confidence. They're so preoccupied with post-colonial guilt that they can't call a spade a spade. Now, that does not mean you tolerate one iota discrimination against law-abiding Muslims. In other words, it's a two-pronged attack. You respect and integrate law-abiding Muslims, and you uncompromisingly fight against radical Islamism. I don't see why that is such a crazy thing to think about.
I'm not saying crazy, but how would you fight radical Islamism? Let's try that, for example. Jonathan, when it comes to the Muslim community in the UK, for example, where you're sitting at, I mean, they're integrated into society, aren't they? Do you feel, though, that, when it comes to the British law, that there are any types of, lenient ways of towards the Muslim community because of fear, as we've suggested here?
There are about 2,700,000 Muslims here in Great Britain, according to census figures, and that's quite a sizable minority in the British society. Most of those people are absolutely, almost certainly law-abiding, perfectly moderate people. However, that's not really where the problem that we're discussing today arises from. And when we look at the reluctance to discuss Islamism, as your other guest there in the studio has boldly put forward, we will find that what the issue actually is that many people in British society, and I think the same is true around Europe, feel that the reluctance to even pin any of these sorts of attacks and this rising extremism to Islamism for fear of offending the vast majority of Muslims who may well be peace-loving people is what's winding those people in the society up. If we just look at what's been going on in Europe, we think about the Brussels Jewish Museum shooting, we think about the France Toulouse shooting of the children in a Jewish school, and we think now about the more than 17,000 people who marched on the German city of Dresden in the last few days, who were protesting against what they called the Islamification of Europe. What we really see is because of this reluctance to deal with Islamism and extremist Islam on the part of most mainstream politicians, members of the public who are concerned about it are sent into the arms of the far right, making sure that fascist movements, which are taking to the streets in those large numbers in Germany and elsewhere, are actually enjoying some sort of increase in support, which is just as worrying for peace-loving citizens of all religions.
No, and rightfully put, Jonathan, because that's exactly where, I think one of the problems lies with saying that it's the rise of the far right in Europe. And I want to touch on that a little bit, because France's far-right National Front has accused François Hollande socialist government of trying to play down the Islamist threat and stepped up calls for deportation of radical preachers and a tightening of border controls. More than 1,000 French citizens are thought to be involved in jihad on the home soils or in Syria and Iraq. But fears of Islamic radicalization in Europe, as Jonathan mentioned, are not exclusive to France. In Germany, more than 17,000 people took to the streets of Dresden on Monday, protesting against the Islamification of Europe. Let's take a closer look at what happened there. I want to ask you this, and we'll get to everybody, and I promise. When we look at this in Germany, and I know, the Islamification, that's the fear, supposedly, of the Europeans. But when we look at something like that in Germany, and I don't want to say just Germans, it's no secret that Europe has a history of not liking minorities. Okay? And that's the fear. The understatement of the year, not liking minorities. Exactly. So if you look at that, and there is a real danger, though, that if there is, the Islamification on one hand, but the disdain for minorities can actually lead to horrific things that happen in Europe. I'm not, I'm not theorizing on that, but the rise of racism and the rise of the far right Isn't that why leaders should be actually very mindful of connecting all kinds of attacks, as we've seen in France, to a larger ism, as you've said, Tsvi, that then can lead to racism? Well, let's start with you.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it looks very bad. I mean, especially when you see, like, right-wing extremists and neo-Nazis that take part of, this demonstration.
And 17,000 of them marching in the streets.
Absolutely. But at the same time, I do not think that it's only like a neo-Nazi movement, because if you look at the comments made by the people and the supporters of this movement, I think this large support comes actually from average German, mainstream Germans that typically would actually vote for Merkel or other mainstream parties in Germany, even the SPD. So basically, we're not talking about neo-Nazis only. I mean, by the way, one of the biggest complaints of, the supporters is that they think that the media tend always to interview like those, neo-Nazi supporters. But I think that in general, we are talking about a wider phenomena, like, other Germans actually support this movement. And we're talking about people who are really concerned. I mean, that's at least what they argue. They're concerned about the future of Germany. And they think that eventually, like, in light of what's happening, the new security threat, I mean, like, for many years, the discussion in Germany was about, whether actually a Muslim immigrant can actually assimilate into the German society. Right. But now the discourse is whether actually they, that they constitute a threat from their perspective to their personal security because of the growing. And just one thing to mention is, like, I think one of the things that really shocked the Germans is, like, that 2 or 3 months ago, in a small city in Germany, Wuppertal, there were, like, few actually young Muslims that were walking around with vests which says, like, Sharia police. And they were trying to prevent young people actually to go and buy alcoholic beverages and go to bars and discotheques. And the Germans were really shocked.
People, all Germans or just Muslim Germans?
Not just Muslims, but also young Germans, even Christians, and that's something that really shocked the Germans. The fear is that, there is too much politically correctness and we're trying to accommodate, but we don't seem to have, like, any commitment from their side. It's one side street. We're doing too much, but on the other hand, we don't get anything in return.
And I think it's a valid point. The fear, though, and Tsvi, I know that you're chomping at the bits to say that. I think the fear, because what you described just now, Esther, and valid points, sounded also like arguments in Germany. And again, I have to go back to the 30s of the last century. They sound like arguments of, genuine concern of local national citizens about the fact that our way of life is being, challenged, et cetera, et cetera. Isn't there a danger in Europe that if fingers are pointed straight at just a specific religion, that can lead to something else?
Look, you have to make a differentiation. If you don't make the differentiation between Islamism and law-abiding Muslims, you're going to have this right-wing reaction. And David Cameron on August 29th said it's a war against poisonous Islamist extremism. He's the first one that came out and said what it is. Now, you can't compare it to the 30s. You can't say the German Jews were not assimilated into Germany and into German culture.
That I will agree with.
And what the European countries have to do is reestablish a certain sense of self-esteem and self-confidence, and reestablish their own constitutionalist principles. In France, there are over 750 no-go zones where the police don't go. There are dozens of no-go zones in England where they want to have Sharia police. In Norway, in Sweden, and everybody's afraid of. Reestablish your constitutionalist principles. And you can do it, by the way, in terms of what I call fighting against gender apartheid. President Eisenhower sent in the troops in 1956 in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I know, but
you have to have some kind of self-confidence in your own principles. The French state has given up the sovereignty of the Republic and the principles of French constitutionalism in 750 areas in France.
Yeah, but when it comes
and it's on a website, by the way. They put it on a website. Don't go there. It's not part of France anymore.
But that said, putting confidence in your national values and then looking at, and Jonathan, actually, I want to touch on that with you. Looking at what's going on in Europe right now, I'm sure the fear also of all these countries, as mentioned, in the lead up to their reports, is ISIS and the threat, and that actually, the extreme Islamists are coming into Europe to wreak havoc there. But that said, we're looking at huge waves of Europeans who are actually making the switch themselves, not born into the Muslim faith, and moving over to war zones. I'm talking about ISIS recruiting people in Europe. What would you say is actually the attraction to that mode? Because we're seeing it all over Europe. And in many ways, that raises the question in my mind, maybe something is wrong with the administrations in European countries that, not only allowing it and being PC, but that young people are looking to steer away from the European way of life and moving into extremism themselves if they weren't born into it even.
In that respect, we've got to remember that despite the terrifyingly large numbers of people who might be going to fight in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, the actual true percentage of Europeans and the European population who are doing that is incredibly small. Right. And so we're not really looking at a mass movement. But what I think is key is what we're discussing now, and we've really got to the crux of the matter in this discussion, which is assimilation into Europe, assimilation into the values of Europe and the values that European countries stand up for is what is key. And what's missing in a lot of the debate, even at political level here and across Europe, is a discussion of what kind of immigrants might be desirable for Europe and specific states within Europe, and what kind might not be. Theresa May here in the UK has just issued a suggestion that after students from outside Europe have finished their education here at university level, they should have their visas removed and they should have to leave the country in order to reapply for visas if they want to come here and work. And this has been given a very mixed reception because to many people it doesn't seem logical that, for example, highly educated and hardworking Chinese students who've achieved degree or postgraduate level qualifications here in Britain should then be shipped out because there is a sort of aversion to some kinds of immigration here. Of course, it's really difficult to discuss this, as we're discovering this morning, without there being accusations of racism. And I think that it's worth just pointing out as well that it's not just people on the street, it's not just the 17,000 marching in Germany, it's not just neo-Nazis, and it's not just the extreme right who are concerned about this, but people are finding they don't have an outlet to explain their concerns. The director of television at the BBC, a man called Danny Cohen, so you can guess what his religion is, has expressed just in the last couple of days, and this is a man who doesn't really talk about anti-Semitism or his Judaism very much on the public stage, has just expressed that having lived all his life in the UK, this is a quote, "I've never felt as I do now about anti-Semitism in Europe. You've seen the number of attacks rise, you've seen murders in France, you've seen murders in Belgium. It's pretty grim, actually. And it's made me think," he said, about is our long-term home actually here in Europe? Because he feels that maybe Jews do not have a place in Britain and in Europe in the future. And he spoke in that interview, which he actually gave in Jerusalem, about the possibility of him and his wife moving to America in the future. So we've really got to sit up and listen when prominent figures like him at the top of their career, a man earning over $327,000
No, Jonathan, I agree, but my
year,
fear with that is the connection between anti-Semitism and radical Islam is really, really dangerous. And I think you would agree with me on that. Hold on. Esther, Dr. Lopatin wants to go ahead.
Well, I think if you look at the recent attacks, most of them were carried by Muslims, not by Christians in Europe. I mean, and if anything is happening, like when we saw it at the recent election for the European Parliament, the Euro-skeptic parties and also even the far-right extremists, like in Strache in Austria or Le Pen even, or like Wilders in Netherlands, all of them are actually expressing very much pro-Israeli views. Wilders actually said, our actually commitment is actually to defend the Jews of Europe, and Strache said the same thing in Austria. So it's really interesting. In Eastern Europe, of course, there is a real problem, like in Hungary and other parts of Europe. But in Western Europe, it's really interesting phenomena. Like far-right extremists that in the past, 10 years ago, were anti-Semitic now.
Right.
They're becoming actually pro-Israelis, and they say that their actually role is to defend the Jews of Europe, which is really interesting phenomena.
Maybe the anti-Islamization movement is actually is causing a pro-Israel approach, but I'm sure Jonathan will nod his head and disagree. That said, Tsvi, do you think? I mean, I don't think that the administrations in Europe are going to, come straight out front and do what you say is, and refer to it as you want them to refer to it. But what do you think can happen in the future if this continues?
Well, I think there are four areas you have to attack, and I think the solution to the problem is grand strategic, not
Pinpointed to not tactical.
And it's long term, like the Cold War. Like you fought the Cold War with the Marshall Plan, you fought the Cold War with NATO, and it took 50 or 60. We're talking about a generational problem here. So you've got 4 areas you have to attack. Number one is dependence on Middle East petroleum. In the last 20 or 30 years, Qatar and Saudi Arabia have contributed over $100 billion to Wahhabi, to the most, it's like 90% of the mosques built in the last 20 years in the world have been financed by Wahhabi money. It's like saying in Christianity, 90% of the churches have been financed by the Ku Klux Klan or something similar to that. We're talking about something, so that's a long-term
It's
thing.
a long-term problem. I mean, Sally, I can ask you so many questions right now on that, and Jonathan, I'm sure, no, I know, but we've got about 20 seconds left, and this is a discussion that could really continue, and we will continue later on our shows, I'm sure, throughout the coming weeks. Thank you so much for being with me this morning, Tsvi, and the same to you, Esther. Jonathan, of course, always a pleasure with you. When we get back, an international treaty seeking to regulate the weapons trade goes into force.